Welcome, and thank you for joining us on a new episode of today's Electrical Estimating. As always, I'm your co-host, Chris Trommer, and I'm joined by our other co-host, Sal Berta.
Hello, everyone.
So today's going to be a different type of format. Usually this is where me and Sal chit-chat for a little bit and introduce you to our topic of the day, but really we're just going to jump right into it today with our guest, Keith, who is one of the co-founders of Armada, which began as a competitive intelligence firm grounded in the discipline of basically gathering and analyzing and disseminating intelligence. So, Keith, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this. This will be fun.
Over your last 21 years at Armada, you've served as sort of an analyst briefing executives on domestic and global economic outlooks, geopolitical risk, supply chain issues, raw material supply, environmental impacts. And I mean, I feel like the list at this point can go on and on. I might have missed something, but is that fairly accurate to say the least?
Yeah, I mean, when I bump into someone in an elevator, the elevator pitch is that we watch the market forces that bear down on companies, and we help them understand it in such a way that they can sort of chart a strategic path through it. So we are watching everything from, as you said, geopolitics to economics. We're watching supply chains and everything that could impact the operations of that company, and just helping the executives understand it far enough in advance that they can do something about it.
Perfect. Well, that makes you the right guest for today's topic, which is something I think everybody's been talking about for the last year, which is tariffs. And what we're going to do today is, in an unbiased, unopinionated, non-political sense, is use your decades of experience to sort of get an understanding of a 60,000 foot overview of what tariffs are, maybe the history in them, how they work, who may be affected, how they affect people, just so that our listeners can get that understanding of this is why this is doing this and how this works and who it's going to affect. So it seems like we got the right guy on here with us today, and I'm very happy and thankful that you were able to join us in such a short turnaround. I mean, we just met via email through an introduction less than 5 days ago, and here we are talking about it. As you said during our conversation, what we might talk about today could be something that changes tomorrow or within the hours of our recording today, which is, let's timestamp it, March 4th at 11 a.m. I think keeping it at this higher level too would also benefit us because, as you said, this is an always changing playing field of sorts lately. Getting right into it, I guess the easiest question, what is a tariff?
Yeah, it's so simple in a way. It's a tax applied to an import, whether it's a product, it could be a service, but it's something that we bring into the United States in this case, and it's literally a tax that gets applied to the importer that brings that item into the country. And I'm sure we'll go into a lot more details, but typically the tax is applied at the port of entry. So it gets captured by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol at that point in time and gets transferred to the U.S. Treasury literally as an import tax. And that's about as difficult as it gets.
All right. And who's paying that import tax? It's the manufacturer or the company importing that product at the port of entry, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
All right. So if I'm a manufacturer in the United States, this is where I'm based, this is where my company is, but my production is being done in Mexico. So when that widget is created and it's being shipped up to me, to my facilities to be warehoused and distributed across the nation, when it hits that US border, that's when they basically take a look at what we're bringing across, and that's where the tariff is imposed at that time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So a lot of importers will take a look at their total landed cost, and their total landed cost calculation could include everything from procurement of that item, right? Could include the transportation costs, maybe some currency calculations and differences in currency. And as of 2 days ago, that would be about the end of it. As of today, then they will add that tax on top of that product cost. So the total landed cost goes up when they finally get the product into their warehouse, and then they adjust the price. And then I'm sure we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but ultimately who pays that tariff and who bears the brunt of that tax can differ, right? And it can be very different across, different industries.
You just brought that up, which was going to be something asked a little bit further down the line, but you brought it up and it's a good point. Who necessarily pays that tariff or that tax that's there? Because, we've heard differing things. I've heard from some sources within the industry where, manufacturers are importing things so that they don't have to pay the tax, but it's here. Others are holding off on doing that tax and rolling it down the hill and actually eating it themselves. So there's a lot of differing things that are out there. But in the simplest terms, sort of who's picking up the tab for a tariff that's getting put onto the products that they're importing.
Yeah, and it is a complex issue because each product, each competitive situation is going to be very different. And Chris, I should have said at the beginning, we were talking about what tariffs are. There's a lot of different reasons to apply tariffs, right? Some of it is financial. In this case, the federal government may literally want to raise money. Sometimes it's to protect a domestic market, a domestic product. And so they apply the tariff to make the domestic products more competitive. Sometimes it's geopolitical. We have an axe to grind with somebody and we apply the tariff based on that. But when it comes to trickle down and how that tariff actually gets paid, whether it gets passed on to consumers, whether it gets, absorbed and eaten by the company, really depends on where they sit in any of those three measures. So if it's purely a competitive situation, then again, they're going to look at their total landed cost maybe against a purely domestic producer and they'll try to understand how much the market will bear and can they pass on that full tariff to customers, or is there enough competition that they can only pass on a portion and they're going to have to find ways to trim import costs or trim costs elsewhere to make up that difference. Otherwise they lose market share when they go to market with a higher price. So they'll adjust their prices based on that situation. If it's purely a single source, like we have a product that we can't source anywhere else in the United States very well. So let's say, a lot of apparel, a lot of clothing today, some electrical items. We don't have a lot of really good domestic sources for those items. And so when the tariff is applied, a lot of those get passed straight through to whoever the end consumer is, either manufacturer if it's electrical, or maybe a wholesaler, or maybe even then consumer if it's a finished product that we bring in. So it will vary by situation. But if a company's sitting on strong profit margins and they decide that one of their strategies is that they want to go build market share, they may eat some of that tariff cost. They may decide to absorb it and to continue to build market share if it gives them a competitive advantage. I think, as you said, and as you're hearing, most companies are going to try to pass on a majority or all of that tariff impact to the end consumer, which is why we hear a lot of political heads, a lot of political folks say that this is not a tax on the company importing, this is a tax on the consumer. And that's what they're saying is there's a trickle down there and a flow through, and ultimately it's the U.S. consumer or U.S. business that pays that tax.
Okay. The first point you made there about, sort of the company that's doing the importing, understanding market conditions and how they're going to, I don't want to say roll down that tax or implement it, I guess would be a better word of looking at it. Are they going to eat a little bit? Are they going to pass down the whole thing? Because one of the things that I haven't firmly grasped is, if you're selling a product for $1 that's made internationally, and a company domestically is making it for $1.25 because, obviously American wages are a little bit more. So we all know American prices are a little bit higher. So when they import that, now there's a 25% tariff on there, or say 40% or 50, whatever it may be. It brings that up to $1.25. So now they're both competitive because you're going to pay the same price domestically or products that were made internationally. Is that sort of the point of the tariff, is to put these companies that are outsourcing the production and the material on more of an even playing field for domestic manufacturing companies?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Now, the gap typically between a domestically produced item and that imported item is typically a lot larger than what you just mentioned,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, right. And so that differential, the tariffs got to be more aggressive in order to offset that. And here's where the discussion gets very complex, and here's why I don't think we hear a lot about it at maybe grassroots or at a corporate level. Is there are things that happen like currency exchange rates. Okay, and I'm going to use a real simple example. So if we apply a 10% tariff on a Chinese product that costs $100, that tariff ultimately, when we procure that product, and let's just make it overly simplistic, costs $110 to buy it. Okay,
Mhm,
after we apply the tariff. But let's say China devalues their currency 10%, which they have up until just recently. That product then, instead of $100, becomes a $90 product because of the devaluation, the strength of the dollar. Then when we apply the 10% tariff, after the tariff, it becomes a $99 product and not a $100 product. So even after the currency exchange adjustment and the tariff application, the product is actually cheaper as it comes inbound. Now, the Trump administration is trying to offset that. They know that game is being played. And so with China, for instance, just in the last 24 hours, you have seen what was a 10% tariff increase with another 10% added on top of that to account for that currency exchange and currency difference. So it's very dynamic when we think about a US product and the cost of that of procuring that product versus importing and laying the tariff on top of it, and you pull the currency exchange rates off of that. It can get really complex. That's why we try to boil it down to the most simplest calculation we can, which is total landed cost.
mhm.
And now with the use of AI and other technologies, calculating total landed cost, we can do some really complex calculations very, very quickly. In the old days, we used to say, well, the product cost was $100, transportation was another $400, and so I know what my total landed cost was. Today, I mean, we've got the, treasury function of money, whether we're making interest on cash that sits in our bank longer versus maybe having to pay an invoice in advance to import it. And, not just the transportation costs, but, you got the currency exchange rates. You have so many different calculations that can go into that. And where I'm headed with this is that at times what we're learning is that we can build the product in Michigan and total landed cost can be as competitive today as it is when we try to import something maybe from China, when we really account for and capture all those costs that go into that final product cost or that what we call total landed cost. So now you're just adding a little extra layer of complexity on top of it when you added a tariff on top of that. But the calculation is still kind of the same. So yeah, companies will look at that total landed cost and as they're buying, try to understand, can I go ahead and use a domestic supplier or do I go ahead and pay the extra tariff and import? And I can promise you at a government level, they're doing some of the same calculations to try and figure out how high that tariff needs to be to try and force companies to say, hey, that US built product is so much cheaper. I'll just buy that one, you know?
So let me ask you, because you brought up a point early on with the currency exchange, excuse me, which is something, I mean, most people probably haven't thought about. I mean, even myself here, thinking about that being part of the tariff situation. So is that why we see fluctuating tariffs when people are talking about 10% to 50%? Because they understand that in certain cases, with that currency exchange, that a tariff has to go higher than others, not in terms of just, hey, we want to make this 40%, but they know that where that product's coming from with the currency exchange, they have to make up for it. So it gets to that level by doing a higher percentage of a tariff on there.
Well, I think they're two different things. So, what you brought up before this, the first question was,
Yeah.
the U.S. product price versus a foreign product price. Typically, when you see 25 to 30% tariffs, the procurement cost of buying something from a foreign market is so much cheaper than it is to buy a domestic product that higher tariff tries to compensate for that difference. Now, on the currency side, what we watch is what we call the net effective tariff rate. And that's what a lot of folks don't focus on because it's really complicated to calculate it because using currency exchange rates and they fluctuate daily almost,
Mhm.
hourly in some cases. But that net effective tariff rate is what we're watching. And so in the very first, let's go back to 2018, 2019, and the first waves of Trump tariffs, right? When you look at the net effective China tariff rate, the impact was like 1 to 2% in the final landed cost of that item. So the difference between the currency exchange as it came down and the tariff and, adding tariff onto it, really there was a marginal impact. It didn't have a big impact at all. And that's why at the time also, we didn't see inflation surge and we didn't see a lot of companies really change their sourcing strategy at the time because, it was kind of a non-deal.
Yeah.
But they learned in that administration, and so now he's a little more aggressive in the second wave, and not trying to make it political at all, just trying to understand the current situation that, now they understand that role of currency and how that works, and so now they're adjusting for it, and so specifically with China, this extra 10% was just because of the currency impact. But
Okay.
when we think about, like, steel and aluminum and copper, those 25% specific tariffs imposed on those are based more on just that differential in cost between buying it globally versus sourcing it in the US.